Hi there and welcome to this session on inflation, which is a little bit a sign of the times, I suppose, that we find ourselves in. Ever since we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've seen inflation spike, and we've done this session really just to try and explain what's happened and where we might start to see a little bit of relief on that. So this is what we're going to try and cover today. We'll explain what inflation is, to start with, what causes inflation, and we're going to be quite specific about there are lots of different causes, but we're going to be quite specific about what we're looking at the current time. What is a wage price spiral, and how does that relate again to the current time? And then what can we do to combat inflation and try and get it back down to some sort of reasonable level again? So to start with, what is inflation? Well, it basically is a measure of how much less buying power the money in your pocket has today than where it was a year ago. So, for example, if a pound bought you a loaf of bread a year ago, that same loaf of bread today is £1.10. It means inflation on that price, on that loaf of bread, is running at 10%. So just to give another little sort of idea, if we looked at petrol price in 2019, 90 pence bought us a litre of petrol. In 2022, 90 pence buys us just half a litre of petrol. Actually, it's a little bit more than that now because petrol prices have gone down slightly since we did this slideshow. So we can look at it in two ways. We can look at it as increased prices, or we can look at it as for the same money, we get less goods. So we can look at that in two ways. If we looked at pizza, for example, in 2020, £9.50 would be the cost of an extra large pizza from Pizza Hut. And now £9.50 gets us just a large pizza from Pizza Hut. So that shows it the other way around as well. So we really need a scenario where inflation is relatively low so that our savings and the money that we're earning has pretty much the same buying power all the time. Now, it's really unusual to have inflation at zero, but for maybe 15 years prior to where we are now, prior to when the engagement in Ukraine started, we did have very, very low inflation. It was targeted at below 2% a year, and we pretty much stayed within that sort of framework, which meant interest rates were able to stay quite low because interest rates and inflation tend to go hand in hand, and I'll explain why in a minute. But things happened in the world which changed all of that. So what in the end causes inflation to go up from a nice steady 2% for all those years to where it is currently, which is just starting to come back down again now, but we did get to a high of about 13.5%, huge jumps. Well, quite simply, we have all of these factors. We had increase in energy costs, and that really was from, again, and I'm going to put everything pretty much back to the Russian invasion into Ukraine because that's what started this whole thing up. So the price of gas went up because a huge amount of that comes out of Russia. Gas is used to create electricity, so electricity went up. Oil prices were going up as well. So that meant transportation costs went up because we needed our oil or we needed our electricity to transport the goods that we were buying. Raw material costs went up because there wasn't as much raw material around. Ukraine, for example, was one of the world's biggest wheat producers. That dropped off quite sharply, as you can imagine. So the cost of that wheat went up. And then labour costs go up because people want more money to pay for the increased prices. So their wage bills go up. So we've got into this sort of fairly nasty cycle. So what does that do then nationally? Well, if we have increased raw material costs because those raw materials are harder to get by, then it means there is an increase in national demand because we still want the same amount of electricity, we still want the same amount of oil, we still want the same amount of wheat, we still want the same amount of everything. Now, if there is less of that around, the demand goes up. And that happened globally. So it wasn't just the UK that was suffering, it was all of Europe that was suffering, it was America that was suffering, it was pretty much everywhere in the world that was suffering. What else can happen? Well, there's another thing that will cause an increase in inflation, and that's an easing of taxation. Now, that might sound a little bit odd. So if I get charged less in tax, I've actually got more money to spend because the government takes my taxes. So if there's an easing in tax, there's more money for me to spend. And because there's more money for me to spend, I will actually go out and buy more, which increases my national demand again, back to where we were in the previous example. And the other thing will be an increase in government funding. So if the government are funding more of the things that we do, and we're putting less of that into that fund, if you like, through tax, then that in itself will make more money available, which means that inflation goes up as well. So all of the scenarios that we've got there all lead to price rises. Let's look also at a wage price spiral. Now, that was one of the factors that I mentioned just now. So if we have inflation, and we start at the very top of that diagram, we've got inflation. We get higher prices of consumer goods because my loaf of bread, instead of costing £1, now costs £1.10p. If I'm still only being paid the same salary, that means my salary doesn't go as far. So I now ask for more salary to catch up with the price of inflation. That means that the overall labour costs are going up. So my employer is paying me more money, which means that he has to now charge more for whatever it is that we produce as a company, which then adds to the inflation as well. So that is called a wage price spiral. And once we're in that, something has to give on one of those links. Either inflation has to start coming down, so prices of consumer goods come down, so there's no more demand on higher wages, which means that labour costs don't go up any further. Or we have lower prices of consumer goods, so there's less profit being made, which means there's less demand for wages, and so on and so on. Or wages just stay where they are, so people end up going into a bit of a decline. The standard of living goes down, and that will break the cycle as well. So all of those things will help break the cycle, but all of them have got painful repercussions. So let's look where we are now. So if we had an overall cost of living going back a couple of years, everything was ticking along quite nicely. We had low inflation. Then all of a sudden, Russia invaded Ukraine. The very, very first thing that happened when that occurred was that gas prices surged. That's because Russia is one of the biggest producers of gas, and all of Europe rely on Russia for at least part of their gas. So if Russia cuts off the amount of gas it's prepared to let go outside of its country, then gas prices soar because there is still more demand but less supply. That has an upward effect on the cost of living. There was a very similar thing happen in oil prices because Russia again is responsible for some oil. So it produces oil as well. Now that means that oil prices will also go up, putting more upward pressure on the cost of living. Now, if oil prices go up, transportation prices go up, which means that food prices must go up. Not only that, of course, we have got less raw materials. We've got less food around because less is being grown. That also pushes the cost of living up. And all of that, of course, feeds into inflation, which starts to go forward, and it went forward very, very quickly. To keep up with that, and we're in that particular point here, and I'm doing this in August 2023, we are still now in a wage spiral inflation scenario, because more people are looking for more wages to get their standard of living back to where it was before this last couple of years of inflation has really kicked in. So we're still not out of the woods. We are starting to get better, but it's not there yet. So what are we actually doing to combat this inflation? Well, there's very few tools really for governments at government's disposal to try and combat this, but we're going to try and explain what they are. There are things called fiscal measures. So fiscal measures pretty much means taxation and government spending. Now, if governments increase taxes, there's even less money around for people to buy stuff with, which means standards of living are going to deteriorate. So all of these measures are very, very unpopular with the populace. People have less pay to spend on necessities and luxuries. Services start to be cut because people can't afford to pay for them. Projects are shelved. Think of HS2. That didn't go now as far as it was going to. I think it's stopping now at Birmingham because there's just no more money to put into it. Think of all the potholes in the roads because there just isn't that money to be put in by the government anymore. And potentially we could lose overseas investment as well because the country doesn't look quite as attractive as it used to for overseas investors to go into. So that's one way that we can combat inflation, not popular. The next way, strangely, isn't popular either. We can increase interest rates. Now, the Bank of England, who is our central bank, are independent of the government, but the only tool that the Bank of England have got to meet their mandate of trying to keep inflation at 2% is to increase interest rates. By increasing interest rates, it's taking money out of the system. By taking money out of the system, it depresses prices. Again, there's bad news on that side of it because as interest rates are put up by the Bank of England, it means mortgage rates go up, which means people are paying more money every month to repay their housing loan. It means the housing market then potentially stagnates because people don't want to move into bigger houses because it costs even more money to do so and people have less money overall. So again, not popular, pretty much where we are at the moment. And then the last one is wage controls, freezing public sector wages. Now, we can't freeze the private sector because that is set individually by different companies. What we can do as a government is freeze public sector wages. And by that, we're talking about all of the things that come under the government's control. Very, very unpopular. Again, people have less money overall. That means people are going to leave the public sector where they can't get a pay rise and go into the private sector where they can get a pay rise. It means that the biggest public sector services, which is the NHS and education, so your teachers, are really struggling at the moment to make ends meet, which means that people are likely to leave the NHS and go into private health care, or they will leave state education and go into the private sector as well, where there is potentially more money, or they will leave education altogether and go and find a different type of job. So all a little bit depressing when it comes to inflation and the methods that we've got to combat inflation. One sort of bright light on the horizon is that the effects that have been put into account over the last few months, which is, if not freezing public sector wages, then at least giving rises out that are lower than the current cost of inflation. Rising interest rates, which has been done now, I think 15 times consecutively over the last 15 months. Not actually increasing taxes, but reducing government spending if we look carefully at that, we can see that it has actually been decreased. All of those things are starting to get some traction, and inflation is now starting to come down. As I say, it peaked at around 13.5% as measured by the Consumer Price Index. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. And it's starting to come now down well into single digits. And we're hopeful within about 18 months we'll be back down towards that 2% again. Now, CPI, Consumer Price Index, that's the measure of inflation that is published once a month. If you can imagine a basket of goods, going around into Tesco's and buying a basket of goods, you pay a certain amount of money for it. If you buy that exact same basket of goods next year, it costs you a different amount. If we work out that difference as a percentage, that's pretty much what the CPI is. Now, what goes into that basket of goods does change from time to time, and of course it doesn't all come out of Tesco's. We take an average of a price of a loaf of bread, so we won't just take Tesco's price. We'll take the mean of maybe 5 or 6 different suppliers of bread, but that would be one of the things in a basket. Maybe a laptop goes in it, mobile phone goes in it, but that may come out at some point in the future and something else goes in. But just remember that CPI is basically an imaginary basket of goods that gives us an overall idea of where we are in inflation as a percentage rate. Hopefully that's made inflation a little bit clearer for everybody. You understand a little bit more about why we are where we are. And hopefully next time we redo this inflation scenario, we'll be explaining why inflation's coming down so quickly. Thanks for watching.